In 1920, inside a laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, a psychologist named John B. Watson did something that would change our understanding of fear forever. He took a 9-month-old baby boy, showed him a harmless white rat, and then terrified him on purpose. Again and again. The goal? To prove that human emotions could be programmed like a machine. The experiment worked maybe too well. The baby developed crippling fears that might have lasted his entire life. But here's the really dark part. Watson never fixed what he broke. The child disappeared from the records, his identity hidden for nearly 90 years. When researchers finally discovered who little Albert really was in 2009, they uncovered a tragedy that made the whole story even worse. This is the story of psychology's most famous and most disturbing experiment. Before we dive in, if you're new here, welcome to The Sleeping Psychologist, where I uncover the strangest experiments and biggest scandals that you most probably slept through. Hit that subscribe button, because we post stories like this every week. And here's a question. If you could go back in time, would you stop this experiment from happening? Drop your thoughts in the comments. All right, let's get into it. Chapter 1, The Man Who Wanted to Control Your Mind. To understand why this experiment happened, you need to understand John B. Watson. In 1920, he was at the top of his game, a psychology superstar at one of America's most prestigious universities. Watson wasn't interested in Freud's talk about the unconscious mind or childhood memories. He thought all of that was unscientific nonsense. Watson believed in behaviorism, the idea that all human behavior could be explained by conditioning and learned responses. Nothing else mattered. Not your thoughts, not your feelings, not your genes. Just what you were taught to do. Watson was inspired by Ivan Pavlov's famous experiments with dogs. Pavlov had shown that you could train a dog to salivate at the sound of a bell by repeatedly pairing the bell with food. Watson wondered, could you do the same thing to a human? Could you condition a person to feel an emotion they'd never felt before? More specifically, could you make someone afraid of something they weren't naturally scared of? This wasn't just academic curiosity. Watson had a radical vision. He once wrote, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select, doctor, lawyer, artist, beggar, thief, regardless of his talents or abilities." He genuinely believed he could shape any human into anything he wanted. All he needed was the right conditioning. But Watson had a problem. He'd theorized about emotional conditioning, but he'd never actually proven it could work on a real person. That's where his graduate assistant came in. Her name was Rosalie Rayner. She was young, brilliant, from a wealthy Baltimore family, and completely devoted to Watson's vision. Together, they hatched a plan for an experiment that would make them famous. They needed a test subject. Someone young enough that their emotional responses weren't fully formed yet. Someone they could shape from scratch. And they found him, a baby boy, around 9 months old, the son of a wet nurse who worked at Johns Hopkins Hospital. The woman needed money, and Watson offered her $1 for her baby's participation. She agreed. They called him Albert B. in their notes. But to the world, he would become known as Little Albert. Chapter 2, Building Fear from Nothing. The first thing Watson and Rayner did was test Albert's baseline reactions. They wanted to prove he wasn't already afraid of the things they planned to use in the experiment. So they brought in a white laboratory rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, masks with and without hair, cotton wool, burning newspapers, basically a weird grab bag of potentially scary stuff. Albert's reaction? He was chill. He reached out curiously, touched the rat, showed zero fear. They recorded this carefully in their notes. Albert was, in their words, stolid and unemotional. Perfect. Now came the conditioning phase. Watson's hypothesis was based on the idea that infants are born with only a few innate fears, loud noises, sudden loss of support, maybe a couple of others. Everything else, he believed, was learned. So if he could pair a neutral stimulus, like a rat, with something Albert was naturally afraid of, like a sudden loud noise, Albert would learn to fear the rat too. Here's how it worked. Watson would place the white rat near Albert. The moment Albert reached out to touch it, bang, Watson would strike a steel bar with a hammer right behind Albert's head. The noise was sudden, sharp, terrifying. Albert would jerk away, startled and crying. They'd wait a moment. Then they'd do it again. Rat, touch, bang, cry, over and over. The first session happened when Albert was exactly 11 months and 3 days old. Watson and Rayner conducted 7 pairings of the rat with the loud noise. By the end, Albert was already showing signs of fear when the rat appeared, even before the noise. 1 week later, they tested him again. This time, they presented the rat without any noise. Albert saw it and immediately started crying, trying to crawl away. The conditioning had worked. But Watson wasn't done. He wanted to see how far the fear would spread. This is called stimulus generalization, when a conditioned response extends to things similar to the original stimulus. So they brought in other objects: a rabbit, a dog, a fur coat, a Santa Claus mask with a white beard. And here's where it gets truly disturbing. Albert was now terrified of all of them. He'd burst into tears, try to escape, show obvious distress. Even a ball of cotton wool made him fearful. Watson had successfully programmed fear into a baby's brain. The experiment was a triumph for behaviorism. Watson had proven his point, but at what cost? Because what Watson did next, or rather, what he didn't do, would haunt psychology for decades. Chapter 3. When Science Becomes Cruelty. Let's talk about what actually happened during these sessions, because the published paper doesn't capture how disturbing this must have been for Albert. Imagine you're not even a year old. Your brain is still developing. You're just learning how the world works. And suddenly, the people around you start terrorizing you. On purpose, repeatedly. The descriptions in Watson and Rayner's 1920 paper are clinical, detached. But if you read between the lines, you can see Albert's distress. After the first loud noise, Albert was startled and began to cry. After the second pairing, he began to whimper. By the 7th pairing, the moment the rat appeared, Albert would start crying and try to crawl away before anyone even made the noise. His little brain had learned. Rat equals danger. 1 week later, they brought Albert back. 5 days had passed since the conditioning. Would the fear stick? They placed the rat in front of him without any noise. Watson wrote that Albert instantly fixated on the rat and then began crying, falling over himself trying to get away. The fear hadn't faded at all. If anything, it seemed stronger. Then came the generalization tests. This is where the experiment gets really ethically murky. Over multiple sessions, Watson and Rayner subjected Albert to encounter after encounter with furry objects to see how far his fear extended. They recorded his reactions meticulously, noting when he cried, when he tried to escape, how long it took for him to calm down. At one point, they even brought in a Santa Claus mask. Albert, who likely had no prior negative experiences with Santa, immediately showed fear and tried to get away from it. But here's what might be the most disturbing detail. Watson and Rayner knew from the beginning that they might not have time to undo what they'd done. In their published paper, they wrote that they planned to attempt experimental removal of the conditioned fears, basically, to decondition Albert so he wouldn't stay afraid. But they never did it. Why? Because Albert's mother, the wet nurse who'd agreed to the experiment, moved away. Albert left the hospital, and Watson lost access to him. Did Watson try to find them? Did he make any effort to fix the psychological damage he deliberately caused to this baby? There's no evidence that he did. The experiment ended when Albert was 11 months and 26 days old. Watson published his findings became even more famous, and moved on with his career. Albert simply vanished from the story. Watson later claimed in lectures that he would have deconditioned Albert if he'd had the chance. But that rings hollow. He had weeks to work with Albert before the family left. He could have prioritized deconditioning over running additional generalization tests. He didn't. The truth is, Watson got what he needed from Albert: proof that emotions could be conditioned. What happened to Albert after that simply wasn't Watson's concern anymore. And this is where the story takes its first dark turn. But trust me, it gets worse. Chapter 4. The Scandal That Destroyed Everything. In October 1920, just months after the Little Albert experiment was published, John B. Watson's world exploded. His wife, Mary X. Watson, discovered love letters between Watson and his graduate student, Rosalie Rayner. The same Rosalie Rayner who had assisted with the Little Albert experiment. The affair had been going on for months, possibly even during the experiment itself. Mary Watson was furious. She took the letters and showed them to her family. And not just any family. Mary came from a prominent political family. Her brother was Harold Ickes, who would later become Secretary of the Interior under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Wasn't a scandal that was going to stay quiet. The letters became public. Baltimore newspapers ran front-page stories with excerpts from Watson's intimate correspondence with Rayner. The headlines were brutal. This was 1920, a public affair like this could destroy reputations completely. Johns Hopkins University, already dealing with another recent professor scandal, had no choice. University President Frank Goodenough called Watson into his office and gave him an ultimatum: resign or be publicly fired. Watson resigned on October 8, 1920. Just like that, one of the most influential psychologists in America was done with academia. He was 42 years old, at the peak of his career, and suddenly unemployable in any major university. The psychology world turned its back on him almost overnight. Watson's colleagues, many of whom had celebrated his work, now wanted nothing to do with him. Watson eventually found work in advertising. He became a successful ad executive at J. Walter Thompson, one of the first psychologists to apply conditioning principles to marketing. He'd helped create campaigns that used emotional manipulation to sell products, putting his theories to profitable use. But he never returned to academic psychology. He never got to continue his research, and he never went back to check on little Albert. Rosalie Rayner divorced her husband and married Watson in 1921. They had 2 children together. By most accounts, Watson applied his strict behaviorist principles to raising them minimal affection, no coddling, treating them like experimental subjects rather than kids. Years later, one of their sons would say their childhood was cold and emotionally distant. Rosalie died tragically in 1935 at age 36 from dysentery. Watson never remarried. Before his own death in 1958, Watson burned most of his unpublished papers and research notes. We'll never know what was in them. Maybe more details about Albert, maybe other experiments he never published. He took those secrets to his grave. But the mystery of what happened to little Albert? That remained unsolved for nearly 90 years, until a psychologist decided to become a detective. Chapter 5. The Search for Albert, a 90-year mystery solved. For decades, nobody knew what happened to little Albert. Watson never revealed his real name. The published paper only called him Albert B. Psychology textbooks told the story of the experiment, but always ended with the same frustrating note: the child's identity and fate remain unknown. Then, in 2009, a psychologist named Hall P. Skip Beck from Appalachian State University decided to investigate. Beck had been obsessed with the case for 7 years, digging through hospital records, census data, and Johns Hopkins archives. He was looking for a baby boy who would have been at Johns Hopkins Hospital in 1920, whose mother worked there as a wet nurse, whose first name might have started with Albert. Beck finally found a promising lead: Douglas Merritt. He was born in 1919 to a woman named Arvila Merritt, who worked as a wet nurse at Johns Hopkins Hospital, exactly what Watson had described. The age matched, the location matched. Beck even used facial comparison software to analyze photos of Douglas and video stills from Watson's experiment footage. Everything lined up. But then Beck discovered something that made the whole story infinitely darker. Douglas Merritt died on May 10, 1925. He was only 6 years old. The cause of death was hydrocephalus, a condition where fluid builds up in the brain. Beck's research suggested that Douglas had suffered from congenital hydrocephalus, meaning he was neurologically impaired from birth. If this was true, it meant Watson had lied in his paper. He'd claimed Albert was healthy and normal, but he may have knowingly experimented on a child with a serious medical condition. Did Watson know? That question sparked fierce debate among psychologists. Some argued that Watson must have known Douglas was impaired. He would have been responsible for screening the child. Others suggested Watson was so focused on his research that he didn't care. Either way, the ethical violations were staggering. Douglas Merritt never learned to walk or talk normally, according to relatives. He suffered throughout his short life, and he died never knowing he was the most famous research subject in psychology history. Or did he? Because in 2014, another team of researchers published a bombshell finding that challenged everything Beck had discovered. The search for little Albert wasn't over after all. Chapter 6. The Truth, Maybe, and Why This Still Matters. In 2014, psychologists Russell A. Powell, Nancy Digdon, and their colleagues published research claiming Beck had identified the wrong person. They argued that little Albert wasn't Douglas Merritt at all. He was actually a man named William Albert Barger, who lived until 2007. Barger fit all of Watson's descriptions better than Merritt did, and crucially, he appeared healthy throughout his life. Barger never knew he might be little Albert. He died before researchers connected the dots. So who was little Albert really? To this day, psychologists still debate it. Some stand by Douglas Merritt. Others insist it was William Barger. We may never know for certain. Both boys were at Johns Hopkins at the right time. Both had the right first name. Both fit the profile. The truth is lost to incomplete records and Watson's secrecy. But here's what we do know for certain. Watson deliberately traumatized a baby for science. He created lasting psychological damage and made no attempt to fix it. And whether Albert was Douglas or William, Watson's actions were indefensible by any ethical standard. The little Albert experiment became a foundational study in psychology. It's taught in nearly every intro psych course. It proved that emotional responses like fear and phobias can be learned through conditioning, a finding that led to effective treatments for anxiety disorders decades later. Therapies like exposure therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy owe a debt to Watson's discovery that conditioned fears can be, theoretically, unconditioned. But the experiment also led to the creation of modern research ethics. Today, no experiment like this could ever happen. Institutional review boards now screen every study involving human subjects. Informed consent is mandatory, not just from adults, but advocates for children and vulnerable populations. Researchers must prove their studies won't cause lasting harm. And if you do cause harm accidentally, you're required to provide treatment to fix it. Watson's experiment was a turning point. It showed us both the power and the danger of psychological research. It revealed that science without ethics isn't just bad science, it's cruelty. And it forced psychology to reckon with a hard question that every scientist must answer. Just because we can do something, does that mean we should? The little Albert experiment is a perfect example of what happens when ambition outpaces empathy. John B. Watson wanted fame, wanted to prove his theory, wanted to revolutionize psychology, and he was willing to use a baby's terror to get there. He succeeded. His work changed the field forever. But at what cost? Somewhere out there, a child, whether Douglas Merritt, William Barger, or someone else entirely carried fears they never should have had. All because a scientist decided his research was more important than one baby's well-being. That child is gone now, but the lessons from what happened to him echo through every psychology lab, every research proposal, every experiment conducted today. We learned that fear is malleable, that emotions can be conditioned, that the mind is far more programmable than we'd like to think. But we also learned that some knowledge comes at too high a price. That science must have boundaries. That understanding human behavior means first respecting human dignity. If you want to learn more about psychology's most controversial experiments, check out my video on the Stanford Prison Experiment, another study that went way too far. And if you're new here, subscribe for more deep dives into psychology's darkest and most fascinating stories. Drop a comment. Should Watson's work still be taught today, or should we stop giving this experiment oxygen? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious, stay ethical, and keep questioning.